demonstrate the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricle is a big ventricle which lies in the cerebral hemisphere. It consists of a central part and 3 horns. Each horn extends into one of the lobes of the hemisphere. The anterior horn extends into the frontal lobe in front of the thalamus. This is the thalamus. The posterior horn extends into the occipital lobe behind the thalamus. The inferior horn extends into the temporal lobe below the thalamus. The anterior horn and central part of the ventricle lie under the corpus callosum and are closed medially by the septum pellucidum. In this specimen, the septum pellucidum is removed to show the cavity of the ventricle with 2 big swellings lying in its floor, which are the caudate nucleus laterally and the thalamus medially. This is the caudate nucleus and this is the thalamus. This is another specimen showing the septum pellucidum intact, thus hiding the cavity from view. This is the septum pellucidum incised and reflected to show the cavity of the ventricle lateral to it. This is the anterior horn. It lies in the frontal lobe. It is the part anterior to the level of the interventricular foramen. It shows the head of the caudate nucleus lying in its floor. It is triangular in cross-section, having a roof, medial wall, and a floor. The roof is formed by the trunk of corpus callosum. The medial wall is formed by the septum pellucidum, and the floor is formed by the rostrum of corpus callosum and the bulging head of the caudate nucleus. This is the rostrum of corpus callosum. This is its genu. This is its trunk. This is a coronal section through the anterior horn of the ventricle. This is the anterior horn. This is the septum pellucidum. Forming its medial wall. This is the trunk of corpus callosum forming its roof. This is the rostrum of corpus callosum in its floor. And this is the swollen anterior end of the caudate nucleus bulging in the lateral part of its floor. The central part of the ventricle begins at the interventricular foramen, that's to say at the anterior end of the thalamus. and ends posteriorly at the splenium of corpus callosum, that's to say, at the posterior end of the thalamus. In other words, the thalamus is related only to the central part of the lateral ventricle. It is also triangular in cross-section, having the roof, medial wall, and floor. The roof is formed by the trunk of corpus callosum. The medial wall is formed by the septum pellucidum and the fornix. The floor is formed by many structures which would be demonstrated in another specimen. In this specimen, the roof of the ventricle, which is the corpus callosum, is removed to show the structures on its floor. These structures are from lateral to medial. This is lateral. It narrows progressively from before backwards to end in a narrow tail, which lies in the roof of the inferior horn. The thalamostriate vein runs in the groove between the thalamus and the caudate nucleus. The stria terminalis, which is a slender bundle of fibers lying just medial to the thalamostriate vein. Moreover, there are a part of the upper surface of the thalamus together with the choroid plexus and the body of fornix. Note that the choroid plexus passes into the central part of the ventricle through the choroidal fissure, which lies below the fornix. This is the choroidal fissure. This is the body of the fornix. This is the choroidal plexus. This is the upper surface of the thalamus. This is the groove between the thalamus and the caudate nucleus. This is a coronal section in the central part of the lateral ventricle. This is the trunk of the corpus callosum. Lying in its roof. This is the septum pellucidum and fornix in its medial wall. This is the narrow part of the caudate nucleus in the lateral part of the floor. This is the striate vein cut in section and lying in the groove between the caudate and the thalamus. This is the choroid plexus lying on the upper surface of the thalamus. This is the upper surface of the thalamus. This is the body of the fornix lying on the upper surface of the thalamus. This is the choroid fissure between the fornix and upper surface of the thalamus. This is the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. It begins at the splenium, that's to say, just behind the thalamus, and passes backwards into the occipital lobe. It is also triangular in cross-section, having a roof, lateral wall, and floor. The roof is formed by the tapetum, which is the fibers running laterally from the splenium of corpus callosum and then turns downwards in the lateral wall of the posterior horn. The floor forms the infromedial wall of the horn and shows two elevations, the upper of which is produced by the fibers of forceps major and is called bulb of the posterior horn, while the lower elevation is produced by the deep calcareous sulcus and is called calcar avis. This is a coronal section in the posterior horn. This is the tapetum forming its roof, descending in its lateral wall. This area is formed by the forceps major, which comes from the splenium of corpus callosum. This lower swelling is the calcar avis. In this specimen, the lateral ventricle and its inferior horn are demarcated by a red line. The inferior horn is the curved lower part of the ventricle, which curves behind and below the thalamus to run forwards inside the temporal lobe towards the temporal pole. This is the inferior horn. It is also triangular in cross-section, having a roof, a floor, and a lateral wall. The roof is formed by the stria terminalis and tail of caudate nucleus. The floor of the inferior horn shows two elevations, the medial of which is produced by the hippocampus, which is a curved mass with a swollen anterior end called the pes hippocampi. The hippocampus narrows posteriorly and shows a bundle of fibers on its medial border called the fimbria of the hippocampus. Lateral to the hippocampus lies another elevation produced by the deep collateral sulcus and is called the collateral eminence. Note that lateral to the hippocampus lies another elevation produced by the deep collateral sulcus and is called collateral eminence. This eminence is not clearly seen in this specimen, a variation which is common in the brain. Note that the choroidal fissure of the inferior horn lies just above the fimbria, and that the fimbria lies over the dentate gyrus. Note again that the fimbria continues posteriorly with the crus of fornix on the inferior surface of the splenium of corpus callosum. Note also that the two deep sulci project into two horns of the lateral ventricle. The calcarine sulcus sinks into the posterior horn to form its bulb, while the collateral sulcus sinks into the inferior horn to form the collateral eminence.